Hey, I wanted to ask you,
Yeah.
we haven't spent any time talking about this,
Okay.
but I did a quick little search and I remember it now with the benefit of hindsight. I wasn't paying much attention, but Paul Orndorff beat Tully Blanchard for the TWA Super Summer Sizzler, which was TWA sort of predated ECW in Philadelphia. That was in 1990. His next match after that, according to Cage Match, was Slamboree 94. And that would have been May, of course, of 94. But in September, and then later in October, and even November, there was a series of television tapings that happened for the NWA. And this is when they were running the Sportatorium. And this is actually Jim Crockett Jr. trying to think about getting back in the business. He ran a series of shows, and I remember reading about this, but obviously I wasn't paying attention. I didn't get any information back then about it, but it doesn't go anywhere. Jim Crockett trying to get back in the business. So in 95, believe it or not, Tully comes back and has four more matches, three with ECW, January, February, March, and then in October, he makes a trip to Japan to wrestle Fujinami. But it's
Okay.
just a damn shame that we saw so little of Tully Blanchard. Like the idea of him jumping at the chance to go back to work for Mr. Crockett in 94. I mean, he had a series of fun matches. Action Jackson, Chris Adams, Devin Michaels. How about Michael Hayes and Scott Putski wrestling against him and Chris Adams? He even
Wow.
wrestled in a match with Junkyard Dog against Black Bart and Rod Price and Skandar Akbar. So there's some interesting names, including a young Curtis or a young Firebreaker Chip who was wrestling as Curtis Thompson. It just never went anywhere. Do you remember anything about the Crockett's trying to get back in and sort of put together the NWA again in 1994?
I remember hearing about that because Jimmy had been basically let go by um, our boss at that time, which was the guy between Hurd and this and Bill Watts.
Kip Fry?
Yeah, Kip Fry. Kip Fry had let him go. Jimmy was Jimmy was, and I'm trying to choose my words carefully here. Jimmy was at one time he got very belligerent working there and was very belligerent to a lot of people, me included. And I remember I went to Kip and I said, Kip, I just left Jimmy's office and he's like going off the rails, irate, bitching about this, bitching about that. He shouted at me. He told me I couldn't do this and I couldn't do that and I wasn't doing this right. And Kip shook his head. Kip said, "Yeah." He said, "Yeah, we're having a lot of problems with Jimmy. I'm going to tell him to go back to Dallas and just forget it. Just don't come back to work here." So he sent him back. Now I'm sure Jimmy still got a paycheck. I'm sure that was still part of the payoff from Turner Broadcasting. But I have a feeling that Jimmy, and rightfully so, was still very pissed off about what Turner did to him when he thought he was going to run the company, and they brought in a knucklehead like Jim Hurd to run the company. But Jimmy's like just like lost it. And so Kip sent him back. And then it wasn't that long after that when I heard that he was trying to run wrestling again back in Dallas, because that's where he had moved and that's where he was living at that time. I guess it didn't work. David still worked for us at WCW, and Jimmy went on to open up a series of, at least I understand, some like Mailbox USAs
Mm.
or things like that. And I guess that's where he was able to continue to make a living that way. But I do remember Jimmy wanting to start to run wrestling again. But I mean, those, those days were over, right? Those
Yeah.
territory days were over. And, almost anybody can open up a independent territory now. But it wasn't like that back then.
We should mention that Harlem Heat actually debuted with the company in June of 1993. and they're actually going to be a part of the dark match opportunity. So before we actually start filming the episode that we're on here, they're going to be in there, I believe, against the Cole twins. But what we're watching right now is an enhancement talent with
Oh,
Pretty Wonderful. You got Paul Roma and Mr. Wonderful. But my favorite part of this is that their manager is the assassin.
yeah.
That is Jody Hamilton from the power plant.
Uh-huh.
That is the real life father of Nick Patrick.
Right.
And then him being a heavy set dude out here in a suit and a mask
Yeah.
tickles the fuck out of me.
The assassin brother. They used him because he could talk. He was one of the
Yes.
better talkers that we had. He was one of the better talkers ever. And so that's why they used him, so he could do promos. And we were still doing a lot of local promos back then that eventually would fizzle out once Eric, turned this into mostly a television show, then an arena business. And so we're in a very transitionary time. Is that right?
It is now.
Yeah, transitionary time.
I'd say transitional, but whatever.
Transitional.
Hey,
time. Yeah.
you guys did Dalton the day before.
Yep.
I assume you're at like the Georgia North Mountain Center, whatever the fuck it's called.
Yeah, right. The Georgia
Whatever.
Sound. Right. Uh-huh.
What'd you think of that building?
It was flat, but it was okay. I didn't mind going up to Dalton.
Did that building have the bleachers that like pulled out like a high school?
No, for some reason they could have been, but for some reason I remember they had bleachers that they would put in there, like that you would put in
Okay.
a carnival.
Well, that was the day before on December 6th, and you've actually got talent across the water, as my dad would say.
Uh-huh.
The Nasty Boys and Great Muda, Jushin Liger, a lot of those guys are tearing it up over in Japan with
Yeah.
folks like Scott Norton. That's happening at the exact same time. There's that tour of Japan going on.
Yeah.
But after you're in Dalton, you're going to run a house show in Kennesaw, Georgia.
Yeah.
Then you've got the actual television taping here in Atlanta. And I just feel like the proximity of those, where we're in Dalton on one day and the next day we've got two shows, one for TV in Atlanta and one's just a non-televised event in Kennesaw, Georgia. Like that feels like, just as far as proximity to Atlanta, Dalton, Atlanta, Kennesaw, man, those are all a pretty easy drive.
Right.
And it makes sense, I guess, because this show that we're watching right now, nobody that you see sitting in those seats paid $1. It was totally free.
Yeah.
But that same day, that live event in Kennesaw, Georgia, let me run you through the matches here. It's Hard Work Bobby Walker teaming with Craig Pittman to take on the Gambler and Big Daddy. Then it's Brian Anderson getting a win over Tom Zink, Diamond Dallas Page beating Jim Steele, Johnny B. Bad beating Tommy Rich, and Tex Slazenger and Shanghai Pierce fighting Too Cold Scorpio and Marcus Alexander Bagwell to a double disqualification. That was the non-televised live event, aka the house show in Kennesaw, Georgia on December 7th. Do you want to guess your paid attendance there that night, Tony?
455.
121.
Wow.
So I'm saying all that to say there's a lot of people who really get their little wee-wees hard when they talk about how many or how few tickets were sold.
Yeah.
Everybody wants to whack off at the glory days of WCW. What you're watching right now is a television taping where not one ticket was sold, it was given away. And where we did try to sell tickets the same day on a card that had Hall of Famers like Johnny B. Bad, the Godwins, Too Cold Scorpio, Buff Bagwell, Tom Zink, and DDP, we sold 121 tickets.
There's a lot of office people in the stands here too that I can see.
Oh, you recognize some?
Recognize a lot of people in the stands. Sure do.
So they're getting paid to be there.
In effect, I guess they are. They're getting paid to be there. This sounds like the old Georgia territory to me, doesn't it? Dalton, Atlanta, Kennesaw. Yeah, just run the Georgia towns.
Jason Taylor wanting to know, can we give you a time code? I'm at 24, 31, 32, 33, 34. Where are you at, Tony?
I'm right with you. Yeah.